Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. So as you know, this mindfulness and self-awareness is everywhere. It's beginning to get a little bit ridiculous. Someone sent me this headline that in 2017, Air Canada is to charge for emotional baggage. Dorval, Quebec. Air Canada announced this morning that in 2017, passengers will be required to pay an extra fee to transport any emotional baggage they happen to be carrying with them. When it comes to homophobia, misogyny, and deep-seated racism, we'll be charging $500 per issue. That kind of emotional baggage is quite heavy and nearly impossible to store safely. It takes tremendous effort on behalf of the cabin crew to make room for those kinds of issues. However, the spokesman continues, low-level anxiety, trust issues, fear of commitment, a sense of entitlement, or garden variety anger due to a delayed flight or lack of gluten-free options in Terminal B, we'll be happy to transport those for you for just $250. Air Canada Terminal will also include an emotional baggage claim. After landing, passengers will be encouraged to visit the claim area, check in with an attendant, and really try to own whatever issues are preventing them from being a tolerable human being. So, of course, we all have emotional baggage. And the greatest wonder in the world is that we feel like we're the only ones who do. I wanted to talk a little bit about a principle that is core in Buddhist psychology, Buddhist philosophy, is the principle of dana, or generosity. And rather than talk about it in terms of generosity as a way to become a better person, I'd like to talk a little bit about how it's really a path of liberation. The practice of generosity is a direct path to freedom. And to honor the request for ending a little early, I'm just going to talk really, really fast, if that's okay with you. I'll be doing some improv along the way, because it's actually it was a long talk tonight. When you are suffering, when you're experiencing stress, you feel separate. Bridging that gap between feeling connected is part of the practice and part of the challenge of coming whole again. So I'd like to talk about how it is that we create the illusion of a separate self, and how you recognize the separate self, how you can heal the separate self, and how you can recognize the separate self through this vehicle of practicing a generous life. There's an old joke. These three old guys are talking about their first memories. And they're always trying to one-up each other. And one guy says, well, I actually remember the light in the room when I was born. His friend says, it's nothing. I remember being carried by my mother, and I can remember the music that was being played at one point. The third guy says, that's nothing. I remember going to a picnic with my dad and coming home with my mom. That's an early thought. On my 3-week sabbatical, Tara and I were kind of doing a working retreat, but we were staying right on the edge of the bay in Cape Cod, and it was unbelievably quiet, really, really quiet. And our days were structured in a way that we were, up really early and working for part of the day, but also doing some, we both love like adventure swimming, so doing pretty intensive exercise, and then pretty much trying to stay awake till 8:30 before we go to bed again. And so I actually had a lot of dreams, more than usual. But I had an interesting, I've always known this, but I actually kind of revisited this. My first conscious thought of a self. And I remember I was maybe, 3 or 4 years old. And my older brother was 4 years older than me, and my father were going somewhere. And I was upset that I couldn't go. And they said, "You're too little." I remember saying, "I'm not too little." And the look of satisfaction on my brother's face, that he was going and I wasn't. And it's an interesting thing that moment when we come into like a conscious thought around an I. Can you remember your first thought? How many of us remember the first time you were aware of who you were as a separate self? I'm just really curious. It's an interesting thing to reflect on. When you go back, how far back does your memory reach? At one point did you come into self-awareness? That recognition of the separate self is a pivotal shift in the development of our psychology, the development of our being even. One of the beautiful things of meditation is the slowing down and the recognizing what's true. You begin to recognize who and what you are. Oftentimes people report that as you slow down, as they begin to pay attention, they begin to notice the repetitive thoughts, kind of repetitive beliefs, habitual ways of avoiding pain, habitual fantasies of, moving toward pleasure. And all of that you begin to see it as all conditioning. You begin to recognize that a lot of who you are is just pure reactivity, moving away from pain and moving toward pleasure. When we go back to that first moment of self-consciousness or self-awareness, there is a very profound shift that occurs. Because at some point, there's a feeling of connectedness. We just feel like we're just responding to life. When you're being carried by your mother, it's womb service, Everything you need is being provided right there. In yoga philosophy and Buddhism are very, very similar. But there's something in Sanskrit called avidya. The word vidya means knowledge. The word a before any word means the opposite. So avidya is wrong knowledge or ignorance. And that has to do with that sense of a separate self. Oh, I'm separate. Oh, I'm different. That's the beginning of what are called the kleshas, which is how you develop yourself as a separate self. Basically what happens is through these kleshas is first there's a recognition that you're separate, and then you start looking for more evidence that demonstrates that indeed you are separate. So that's the development of egoism, a development of your ego. And then you start developing a list of what you like and what you don't like. And as your life goes on unexamined, your list of what you like and what you don't like gets longer and longer. And that leaves you with the final klesha, the fifth klesha, is the fear of death. Because you've invested your entire life into this story of who you are, what you like and what you don't like, and it's all going away. As I've often said before, meditation is the practice of dying while alive. That you actually get to examine those aversions and those attractions. You actually get to take a really closer look at that development of the separate self and give it some real rigor. Really examine that, and you oftentimes can find there's freedom where there isn't before. First blush in the practice of meditation, there's a little more space between stimulus and response. Something comes at you, and while you would react immediately, there's a little more space, and that gap is the difference between getting caught in habitual reactivity and new possibilities. So in an unexamined life, we go through life feeling separate, cultivating this narrative of who we are and where we're going. Dale Carnegie famously said that everyone is listening to the same radio station, WIFM. What's in it for me? And it's a fascinating observation, because when you look at most people, that's the filter they're looking through. What's in it for me? They're coming from that egoic place inside, from a kind of a self-preservational perspective. And once you recognize that, it becomes very, very interesting, because when you realize that everyone is coming at what's in it for me, then you can begin to communicate to that. And then suddenly you develop some mastery and flexibility in communication. That's part of the beauty of his message. But what spiritual practice does is it really opens up that question. Well, who are you really? And how do you recognize that separate self? And what is a non-separate self anyway? It's relatively easy to identify the separate self. All you've got to do is look at where your complaints are. Look at where your stress is. Look at any place where you're suffering. That points toward the separate self. So back on the Cape, no noise. We could even have the doors open and not have our ADD dog going crazy at every little sound that went by. I had a dream, and I'll spare you the details. There's nothing worse than someone saying, "Can I tell you about my dream?" But in this dream, I'm going to give you the headlines here. There was some conspiracy among some friends of mine not to tell me about something. And then I found out. And in this dream, I was angry. I felt betrayed. I felt embarrassed. I was trying to get their point of view, and I kind of wanted to forgive them, but not yet, because I wanted them to know how hurt I was. And then I woke up in the middle of this dream. And like for the next 10 minutes, I kept churning it over again, thinking like, well, why would they do this to me? You know, like what jerks? And then I realized, no, that none of this happened. None of this happened. It was all a dream. Who we are, on one level, is a collection of thoughts, a collection of stories. And that dream was so revealing for me, because once I realized that fabrication that had me so tight was just illusion, I had a few moments of that just pointing back toward the mystery. Just that sense of this space of consciousness that thoughts pass through. Sometimes they pass through easily, sometimes they get tight, and we find ourselves utterly attached in reactivity. So we have this sense of self. And you know what it's like in the morning when you wake up. You're feeling great. And then you watch the program start to boot up. And then suddenly, before your feet hit the floor, you're already anxious. What the practice can do is it can help to remind us that we are more than our thoughts. and we're more than this changing body. So I thought we would do a little reflection on this. And I'd like to refer to a little bit about the makeup of the body, and then just a reflection on what are called the aggregates, the different components that make up this sense of self. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might let your attention open to your breath and just sense, if you can, the breath outside your body, the air outside your body, and as you breathe in, the air inside your body. And just feel this movement of breath. And feel the element of air, one of the four primary elements, the space inside you and the space outside you. And sense your bones. Feel the weight of your arms, the weight of your legs. Feel your teeth, this element of earth. And sense inside any quality of pulse or tingling, of warmth, this element of fire. And sensing inside the element of water, of how much of your body is made up of water. I like to offer a short reflection on the 5 aggregates. Just giving you a little bit of time just to sense each. The first is this level of form, this coalesced blending of the 4 elements of air, earth, fire, and water. And sensing the form of your body and the form of all that is around you. The next level is the realm of feeling. And notice how arising from the 4 elements of your body are the arising of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations. Shifting, dancing, changing. Arising from feeling is this quality of perception. What is it that perceives pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral? Can you sense that mechanism? Arising from perception is what we can call mental formations. The stories, the narrative. Just acknowledging this mechanism of awareness. And from form, from feeling, from perception, from the mental formations, there is consciousness. There is that which is aware of this entire dance. Accessible when you relax and when you pay attention. So deepening the breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open. So through this lens of Buddhist psychology, that's you. Form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. You are all those elements, all happening at the same time. And so there is this self that lives inside that mechanism, this story of who you are. And just as you get to see what enlivens you, what closes you down when you pay attention, you get to see into the nature of this relative conditioned self. You get to know it pretty well the more you practice. I was recently in a conversation around a family event coming up, and I'm a little agoraphobic. I'm cautious around being around groups. And it's interesting, most of the groups that I like to be around are the ones where I'm kind of running things. But I just try not to go where there are lots of people. And so there was a family event coming up, and I realized once again, I just didn't want to go. You know, there's something called FOMO, the fear of missing out. I have what's called phobi, which is the fear of being included. And so I realized with this event coming up next year that I could opt not to go. But something around that didn't seem right. And so I thought, part of the realization in mindfulness is when anything is occurring, you have two options. One is you can change the external conditions, or you can change the internal conditions. And so I decided rather than not go, this was an opportunity for me to look at my attitude, to look at my own conditioning. And I realized that I want to be a generous person. That I kind of identify as a generous person, and that's what I wanted to do. And so that intention to be generous suddenly became a pathway from excluding myself to actually including myself, being connected. And generosity becomes a very, very powerful pathway to connect where you feel disconnected. So I want to say a little bit about that, about how we can use generosity to heal that separation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when we are in pain, we separate ourselves. We feel that we are unique. We feel that we are different. The classic story from Buddhist lore, which I've shared here before, is the story of a young woman who lost a young child, and went to the Buddha and said, "You're a spiritual master. Bring my child back to life." And the Buddha said, "I will on one condition." He said, "Find a household where death has never visited, and then come back and we'll talk." And so out of her pain and out of her suffering, she went on a quest. Went to every house she could find, very eager as a way to get her child back. And she realized, of course, over a long period of time, that she could not find a household where death had not visited. And that resulted in two things for her. One, wisdom of recognizing that everyone is visited by death at some point. Everything born of causes and conditions is subject to fall away. The second that she saw, that she gained from that, was compassion. Recognizing that in her own suffering, her suffering was everyone's suffering. There was nothing unique about her suffering, not to take away from her own pain, but that actually connected her to others. So again, just a short reflection, if you would. With your eyes closed, you might just take a few moments to reflect on one of the biggest and hardest challenges that you've had in your life. One of the more painful things that you experienced. And you might, as you just breathe into that, just recall what that was like at its hardest. What were the lessons for you to learn here, as painful as they were? How did that experience change your life? And you might imagine now all those on this planet that may be going through something similar. And you might, in your own way, just feel the resonance in your heart for them. What advice would you offer someone who's going through right now what you went through? What advice would you offer them? And you might, in your own time, let your breath deepen. And let your eyes open, or you can remain with them closed. When we can allow our own pain to connect with others, there is a natural quickening of the heart. I think that one of the translations from Buddhism is the quivering of the heart in response to the pain of others. And generosity becomes a natural response to the suffering of others. It's one of the paramitas, or the 10 perfections, which I won't go into because we're going to end a little early. But it's an interesting thing to explore these 10 what are called the perfections, or the states to aspire to. But it's a very interesting way to explore them, because rather than sort of like the 10 Commandments of thou shalt not, these are more of a description of an awakened person, of someone who is awake is naturally generous. Someone who is awake naturally responds to others. Someone who is naturally awake has a quality of wisdom or insight, and so on. Again, I'm going to skip this part. So the question becomes, when you explore generosity, becoming more generous, are you doing it to be a better person, just to improve yourself, or are you doing it as a way of liberation? It's been said there are two paths. There's the path of means, or the path of self-improvement, becoming a better listener, becoming a better partner, becoming a more effective person at work. Those are really all wonderful things. Become more skillful in your life. But then there's the path of liberation, the path of awakening. There's a beautiful system, if you're not familiar with it, called the Enneagram. Are many of us familiar? Anyone familiar with the Enneagram? a beautiful, beautiful system. It was kind of a verbal tradition, and only about maybe 80 years ago it was kind of codified, written down. That there are nine points where we tend to calcify, and your character structure tends to fall into one of those nine points. And one of them is what's called the caregiver. It's number 2 on the Enneagram. And the system is quite fascinating. You can look at it from the level like a horoscope, or you can look at it from a level of very, very in-depth psychology. And there's sort of a gradation from each one of these character points, and you'll fall into one of these if you look at it. One is sort of like the highly functioning, and then all the way down to the completely dysfunctional. So the caregiver, the highest quality of this character structure is a saint. You give because what else would you do? You're so full of love and energy. One of my teachers described it as like you're a rain cloud. You can't not be kind. You can't not be nice. The dysfunctional part of the caregiver is you're giving with a clipboard. Whatever you give, you're making mental note, and now that person owes you. And it can show up with resentment, After all I've done for you, you do this to me? Again, back to that tight egoic self. So there are ways that we can explore generosity as a way of improving ourselves. But it can also be a very powerful way to really explore how you can find real and true freedom. I was reading about this many, many years ago, this whole path of generosity, and I was in the Peace Corps in Niamey, Niger, West Africa, and I was house sitting for someone who worked for the State Department, so I moved out of my funky little Peace Corps quarters into this really nice house. And I remember very specifically, I was reading this really interesting book about generosity and the heart. And it was saying, whatever anyone asks of you, double it, just as a spiritual practice. And there was a knock on the door. This fellow came, he was from Sierra Leone, and he looked really, really down and out, really beat up. And he said that he had this medical condition, and he had to get back to Sierra Leone. His father had a ranch in Sierra Leone, but he went to the bus stop, and he had to sleep there, and someone beat him up and took all his money. And he had this chest thing, and then he started coughing really violent, and he showed me this X-ray. He said they didn't get my X-ray because I had it like in my pocket. And then he started coughing, and then he spit up blood. And he said, I need money to get back to Sierra Leone. Could you help me? I need whatever it was, like $50. And I was so completely taken in by this guy. And so I said, wait here. And so I gave him like $150. Just so I thought, here's my practice. And he thanked me profusely. He gave me this address. He said, I will get back to you, when I get home. And I felt so good. It was really interesting how good it felt that there was that happenstance of being able to really make a difference in someone's life. 3 days later, I was at the Peace Corps office, and there was this little bulletin saying, be aware of this guy who's going to show up with an X-ray, and what he's doing is he's biting his inner lip, making it look like he's coughing up blood. Like, oh no, I got scammed. But the interesting thing was, my act was pure. My response was pure. It definitely falls in the category of trust God but tie your camel. But acting generously can be a very, very powerful practice. So I'm going to truncate my talk. And we're going to close with a short reflection. As you bring your attention to the breath, just sensing what it means to be generous. Is there one thing that you might do as an act of generosity? Is there someone who might appreciate a phone call? Is there someone who you feel is struggling or suffering? Or you might extend yourself to them. And if you were to offer a generous act, what would that feel like? As the Buddha taught on dana, on generosity, he said with generosity there is a threefold benefit. One is the wholesome state that you cultivate when you anticipate being generous. The second is the act of generosity itself, of freely giving of yourself. And third is the wholesome pleasure you derive from reflecting on your generous acts. And deepening the breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open. Just a few more things before we close. It's a real honor to be able to teach in the system of dana. This class is offered freely. So the church receives no direct compensation for making all of this available, and IMCW, which kind of runs the website and has its own staff, the yoga teachers and myself, we receive no direct compensation, for this offering. And it's really done from a pure joy, from really wanting to make this available. And I know for myself that there are those that come to class that wouldn't come if there was a direct charge. And that feels really great for me. In the classic practices, the monks or practitioners received no direct support, but the community supported them through their generosity. And thus it became very much of kind of a free-flowing practice of selfless offering. So I thank you for your ongoing support, because it truly does. It supports the church with all they're doing. It supports IMCW with all their work in the world. It supports the yoga teachers. And it supports me to be able to continue to do this. So I'm immensely grateful. And I thank you.